sampling design becomes very important. We often do probability sampling. And when you do probability sampling, you need to find out what number of people are actually going to respond to this and which way they're going to respond. Random sampling is a sort of probability type sampling, where if you know that you've got X number of people that are going to respond, you have to know what sample size you're going to deal with and how you're going to be able to sample them randomly. And randomness basically means that it has to be random. You have a certain group that you're looking for, but you have to have those people picked randomly because that will give you the best cross-sectional reading on everything. Purpose of randomness is to let blind chance to determine the outcome of the selection process to as great a degree as possible. So in randomness, you're picking out things. So you've got this huge pool and you want to have one person with this and this particular background, and you've got those in there. You pick randomly out to see who's going to be the person that's going to respond. And that becomes very important in sample design because it takes the variability out. Sometimes we use a random number generator, and the random number generator will tell us or pick exactly for us. You can have a stratified random sample, which means you have different layers of randomness that you've got to go through in order to be able to get the proper sample design in this. Example they have is 4th, 5th, and 6th grades. So in it, you want 10 kids out of the 4th grade, 10 kids out of the 5th grade, 10 kids out of the 6th grade. And based on that, you're going to be able to get a random sample of 4th graders, 5th graders, 6th graders, so you can compare 4th to 5th to 6th, or 4th to 6th, or 5th to 6th, or whichever way you want. But that would be stratified because you've got different areas that you're looking for your randomness. You can have a proportional stratified, which means that, let's say you've got 50 kids in the 4th grade, and you've got 40 kids in the 5th grade, and 30 kids in the 6th grade. When you do your sampling, if you want to sample 10%, that means you've got 5, 4, and 3 that you sample randomly. They would be proportional compared to sampling 10 out of each, which would not give you a proportional design. Proportional says it's based on the percentage of the population. So if you're doing political and you want to know this, and you know the percentage of your population that belongs in one ethnic group, you use that percentage of your total would be out of that ethnic group. So these become very important and you have to look at it. And that's where they go out and they can say, well, based on the sampling we did, we know this about this particular group or this about this particular gender. There is non-probability sampling. And in this, it basically comes down to convenience sampling. You're out there on a Saturday in front of a restaurant, and whoever comes in, you ask the third person that comes in. So you count 1, 2, third person, you ask them, go 1, 2, third person, you ask them. It's total convenience. And you're only doing those people in that particular area. You'd kind of call that accidental. It doesn't look at a representative sample. It looks at a sample of what you've got in that particular area. If you go to a soccer match and you ask how many people like baseball, you're going to get a totally different answer than if you go to a baseball game and ask how many people like baseball. Convenient sampling is convenient. It's there. You go to a natural food store and you ask questions about, GMOs, you're going to get a totally different answer than if you go somewhere else and ask the same question. The example that I heard of is is a restaurant. You go out and they had the restaurant and they started sampling beginning first thing in the morning to find out what people's opinions about certain things were. What they found was in the sample, they had 36 males and 4 females, which is not representative of the population. But if you came back and you did it at 9 o'clock in the morning, it would be just the reverse. So you have to look at this because it's non-probability sampling. You're basically just taking what's convenient. You can look for a quota system. And in the quota, it says respondents are selected in the same proportion of the general population. So 50% of your respondents would be male and 50% would be female because that's roughly the same proportion in the general population. And then you would have to fit in the other groups that you were looking for, the other ethnic groups to try and fit this in. You can have a purposive sampling. And in that, it basically goes back to for a purpose. Example here would be, you want to find out what the people who use the St. Mark's bike trail are about. You go out there on the St. Mark's bike trail and you ask people. If you want to find out who's using the St. Mark's bike trail, you don't go over to the local McDonald's and ask, oh, do you use this? So you go out there for a purpose. You go to the place where everybody is there and you would use that particular information. You can also look at very large populations. and this becomes very important because when they go out and they sample these things for elections, they don't sample everybody. They pick a very specific unit. The sample must be representative of the population, so you can use a small portion of it. And sometimes they only use a couple of thousand individuals to represent 300 million people, but it gives you a small representation of it. The basis must be a representative sample in here, which means you may have multi-stage sampling areas where you may sample an area here and an area there and an area here and an area there. So you look at different units in this. In a multi-stage, you've got your primary area where you're looking things, and then you've got secondary areas, you've got a sample location selection. So if you really wanted to look at big city and what happens in the big city, you may figure out we want to look at the Northeast. Then out of there, we're going to pick these specific areas that we deal with. Or you can do a chunk selection, which means you just randomly pick an area and you say, we're going to sample this area and see what comes out of it. You could do a housing unit selection. And in the housing unit selection, you go out, I'm looking for this particular group and I'm going to go to a housing unit in this type of city over here that has this amount. And we're going to use that as a part of that. Now, on each one of these, what we're doing is we're going to a smaller and smaller area. When you look at sufficient sampling size, there are some guidelines that sometimes are out there, and this says if your population size is less than 100, you need to sample everybody. If your population is less than or equal to 500, you want to go and you want to sample about half of the population, which means you're looking at about 250. If your population's above 1,500, you can get away with 20% of the sample, which means you can go out there and sample about 300 people. And if your population's over about 5,000, well, what you're going to do is you can go out and sample about 400 people. And 400 people is less than 10% of 5,000, but if you got 40,000, then it's only 1%. But it's still going to give you a representative sample because the sampling size becomes very important in there. The larger your sample, the smaller the sample size you need, relatively. One of the things we look at is bias. And bias comes in when things are not sampled properly. Bias says any influence, condition, or set of conditions that singly or in combination distort the data. So you have to be careful about bias because bias will throw the whole thing off. Sampling bias is one of the biggest problems we have, and in sampling bias it comes down because you aren't really sampling the area properly. So when you're dealing with things, it says you want to look for things a priori, which means you want to see it beforehand so that you can try and make sure that there is no bias in there, because bias gives you distorted results. So when we're looking at large samples or surveys or things like that, we have to look at a lot of different things, and in descriptive research, we're basically thinking about things ahead of time before we do the actual research. It takes a lot of planning, it takes a lot of structure, but it can often give you a very good result when you are looking at describing what is going on.